Hey y'all, it's Laura, and I'm back with a Cocoa Vanilla Studio layout using the Legendary collection. Now, these are two photos of my oldest son, and he has gotten some new glasses this year and decided to grow out his hair. And so I thought it was due for an update in his album of his current style, what he looks like, and seeing as how he doesn't have a lot of picture-taking opportunities at the moment, with everybody being pretty much stuck at home, I decided that his updated look was a worthy reason to scrap some photos. So, being the sweet boy that he is, he agreed to let me take a couple of photos and go ahead and get them scrapped. This is going to be a star-heavy layout, and it's also going to be using up a lot of scraps. So if you're down to scraps in your scrap bin or from your collections, this is a great place to start. To begin with, I pulled out these larger stars from the die cut pack. They have the look of a cut file, and I really like that. So I decided to go ahead and do a couple of these on the outside edges of the page, and then I'll bring in a bunch of smaller stars to scatter around them. Now, what I'm initially thinking here is I want to do a bit of a balanced opposites kind of thing. So the side on the left is going to be top heavy, kind of trailing down into less stars at the bottom, and the right side will be the opposite. So I'll have a little spattering of stars at the top that leads down to a thicker layer of stars at the bottom. So kind of a yin and yang, they're opposites in a way. And I am pulling from the ephemera pack first because it had a lot of the neutrals, the grays, the dark blues, and those are colors that are present in my photos. So I want to make sure I include some of those before I go absolutely crazy with all of these punched and fussy cut stars. Now there is a star paper in the Legendary collection called All Star, and so I fussy cut a whole bunch of those stars out, even the teeny tiny ones, and went ahead and added them to this little pack, as well as punching out a bunch of scraps. This is a brilliant layout for using up scraps because it doesn't use any large pieces of paper at all. I've simply punched out the scrap pieces left over from previous layouts, as well as fussy cut that star paper to get a multitude of sizes and colors and patterns so that not all of the stars look the same. I will layer some of the smaller stars on top of the larger ones, but not all of them. I really want it to feel very random and just kind of tossed on there, as if you just grab these stars and just tossed them at the layout, and wherever they landed, that's where they got to stay. Obviously, that was not actually how I put this layout together, but it'd be kind of fun to give that a try, I think. Now, I didn't want to bore you with me placing stars the entire video, so I did kind of skip ahead after I had started gluing things down. So I used some glue dots and went ahead and attached the majority of these big stars down first, and that way you can kind of see. Now that I've got the big stars in place, I move on to the smaller stars. I find this is extremely helpful with shapes like this where you're trying to cluster them together, to start with the larger end of the spectrum and then move into the smaller ones. That way those larger stars have their place and you can kind of piece in the smaller shapes around them because they're a little bit more flexible. They have a smaller size, they take up a lot less room, and so they can kind of fit in a lot of places. Whereas if you start with the small ones and try to fit the big ones in, that's not going to puzzle together quite as easily. Now I am using pop dots for this just simply because it's fast, and glue would work as well, but in this case I didn't want to bend the paper, and I am using a piece of paper that was left over from a previous kit. Is just white on the back, and so I just flipped it over and used it as white cardstock. So if, for example, you have paper pads and you don't know what to do with some of the papers, they're just not really your jam, flip them over and use the back as white cardstock. It's still getting used. It's not getting wasted, and I find that's the best way to keep from having a bunch of papers or a bunch of supplies in my stash that I don't love, is to just go ahead and find a new way to use them. This particular layout was a great deal of fun to put together, and once I got started with the little stars, it really just became a bit of a method, of a routine of just, okay, this one here, trying to make sure that I don't have too many of the same colors in the same places. Now there's not a lot of red in this collection, but my son did have red on his shirt, and so I wanted to make sure to pull in as many of the red pieces as I could fit in, because I wanted it to reflect some of the colors from his shirt, but not all of the colors from my photos are reflected in these stars. And that's okay. I do have a technique that I call color avoidance, where I don't always pick up every color that's in my photos. In this case, it is the blue in his shirt. I do not have any of that shade of blue on this layout, and that helps to draw your attention into the photos first, because you're avoiding a color that's in the photos, and so your eye is going to be drawn to the one place where it exists on the layout. And so that's just a little technique that I like to use. I was shaking the layout just there to make sure that everything was glued down where it was supposed to be, and getting some more smaller stars added on. Now eventually I'll get down to the teeny tiny little stars, and I'll have to use some glue, because these little glue dots even were too big for the teeny tiny little stars. This was such a fun layout to put together, and I think having the larger stars with the cutouts in the center really give this kind of a dynamic look, and I think that's probably my favorite part of this layout. Now once I get all of the stars in place, I will just simply add a title and some journaling and a couple of small embellishments, and that'll be it. Because I've put so much time into creating this background, you don't need to embellish heavily around the photos. And this is also a great way to step into a different style of scrapbooking. If you're used to a very linear style of having large strips of paper and columns or grid layouts, this is a little bit more free form, a little bit more whimsical, and it can be a pretty easy way to step into that whimsical style and a little outside of your comfort zone if you do tend to lean toward linear scrapping. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this particular design is that you don't have to fill every single inch of space. It is good to fill any big gaps in, but don't worry about covering every tiny little millimeter of white paper that is showing. I focus more on the shape that I'm trying to create with these stars, and also the colors, and trying to make sure that I'm not overdoing it with red in one area, overdoing it with yellow in another area, trying to get a good balance of colors and sizes around the page. Now, as I continue with these smaller and smaller and smaller ones, I will get down to some that are teeny tiny, and those I use as scattering. I add that at the end of every single one of my layouts to add a nice bit of detailing that really makes the layout feel complete. And continuing in that order, the large, the medium, the small, and then the teeny tiny, again, just makes it a lot easier to fit those little bits and pieces in, as opposed to the larger pieces being at the end. While I'm just sticking and plonking all of these lovely little stars everywhere, I want to talk a little bit about photographing teenagers. I have found it a bit tricky to get great photos of my older kids now that they're teenagers. Quite often they like to hide up in their room. I have quite a few kids, so it can get a little wild downstairs, and so I don't blame them for seeking a little bit of refuge, but sometimes it's really nice to just take one of your kids outside into the beautiful sunlight and get an updated picture. They don't have to smile. Sometimes I get better photos if they even just make silly faces or just act kind of goofy, and that's perfectly fine with me. In this case, I was documenting my son's long hair as well, so that's why I have a photo from behind, but normally I would do a photo that's up close like the one on the left, and then a full body shot on the right, just to kind of have an update of how do they look? What is their current style? What kind of clothes are they into at the moment? What colors are they favoring? Those kind of things may seem small, but it's interesting to see how much kids change from year to year, and how that style and the reflection of themselves changes as well. And so I think it's really neat to go ahead and have that kind of an updated look from year to year in their albums. I do create separate albums for each of my kids, and just try to document their journey separately, because I have so many siblings and I don't want them to feel like they get lost in the the family albums because maybe one of their siblings does things that, or they prefer to get their picture taken, or they do a lot of activities, and so we take a lot of photos. And I don't want them to feel left out. So they each have their own albums that celebrate them. So now that I have all of those extra bits and pieces trimmed off the outside, I have come in with some arrows and some little word phrases. Those came from a sticker sheet that I cut apart because it was almost done. And so I just went ahead and cut it apart and stuck it in with my ephemera pieces. Now I have this title. I had Hello Cool Dude, and I was going to try to use all 3 words, but once I got all of these stars in place, I really felt like it was a bit much. So I instead used a word phrase and then just cool dude. And I will tuck in my journaling ahead of that word cool, just above dude, and so that it kind of fills in that gap. Because leaving big gaps like that can sometimes make your layout feel a bit disjointed. And so by filling all of those gaps in, whether it's with tiny embellishments, whether it's with journaling or strategic journaling, as it were, just to make it fit into those spaces, it really helps to give it a more cohesive look, like everything fits in. Now I have found some teeny, super tiny stars. You probably can barely see them, and I am adding those around as well because I get a bit excited to do the tiny embellishing. It is my favorite part of scrapping every single layout, is adding those teeny tiny little embellishments. They just add so much detail and just give it such an extra little oomph that I really enjoy. I am using a tonic glue pen to get those down. It has a nice fine nozzle on it, which makes it very easy to get very thin beads of glue out. So as I get all of those bits and pieces added on, I will then come in with my Nuvo Gold and just kind of dot that around a lot like splattering. And I'm actually not going to use gold ink on this one because I didn't think it needed it. It already has a splattered effect once you add in these tiny little stars and those Nuvo drops as well. I do hope you will stay till the end to see the detailed photos, as well as check out the Cocoa Vanilla Studio blog at cocoavanilla.com.au to see the detailed photos and explanation for this layout and see what products that I used. One more thing I wanted to mention before this video finishes up is that you could use this particular design with any kind of shape, whether it's hearts, circles, stars, florals, or any mix of stickers and ephemera. You could have this same idea as a background. You could do 4 corners. It doesn't have to be the 2 borders along the side. You could do a wave shape and not just this scattering smaller to larger, and that would work as well. So I am going to add a border to the outside of this layout. I had purposely cut it down about 1/4 of an inch on each side before I started adding my stars. That way I can go ahead and add a nice border that helps to rein in all of those floating shapes. And then I'm going to add a quick pen drawn border around the outside that kind of adds a bit of a shadow behind that white cardstock and gives it the impression of having depth. It's a nice little trick that I really enjoy the look of. So now that I have everything in place where I want it, I've decided I'm going to bring in some more of these word phrase stickers and add them to some of the larger stars around the page. I will go in and kind of arrow cut out the sides of all of those, or fishtail, however you want to refer to it, and that just gives them a little bit more of a fun shape, and then just adhere those down because they are in fact stickers. So you see I'm just cutting out little arrow shapes on the edge of each side of those stickers and then just placing them down on top of the stars. And then I'll come in with my T-square ruler to add some journaling lines. Now I purposely wanted to fill in this space between my title and the photos, and I think just adding a little bit of journaling here is all I really wanted, and so that worked out perfectly. Adding some enamel dots to a couple of the stars and around a couple of the stars for, again, more of that added detail, and to use up some of these lovely little enamel dots. I especially love the small ones, and this collection has a nice long bead of the small ones, and those are absolutely my favorites. I love those tiny enamel shapes, but they're not the only thing I'm going to use. Like I mentioned earlier, I will bring in some Nuvo drops. They're crystal drops in gold, and they will add a little bit of a scattering effect all around the page. Of course, that's after I add my journaling. Now, in the journaling, I'm just talking about how this is an updated layout photo spread of his style and how his new glasses and his haircut give him or lack of a haircut, I should say, his hair length gives him a little bit of confidence. So just dotting around kind of randomly with the Nouveau just to give it a splattering look without actually having to make a giant mess with my gold ink and getting it all over the stars. This is a little bit more controlled and definitely functions in the same way. I hope you've enjoyed this layout, and until next time, bye guys!